that our colleague, Rebecca Stone, cannot be here tonight. She has an important family responsibility in New York, and that's exactly where she should be. There are calendar displays, the subcommittee meetings for January. I think you can see them up there, and then further on, it also displays, I think, the full set dates of the full school committee meetings for the balance of the year. Am I right about that, Ms. Coyne?
Just through January.
Just through January. I saw.
In our packets.
Oh, it's just in our packet?
It's not up there.
Okay. Okay. And also, I believe the calendar displays, does it, the superintendent forums that have been scheduled? For anybody who would like to. Good evening, sir. How are you?
Good.
Good, thank you. No problem. And so we do have a consent agenda having to do with two past records of December 13th and 18th, and also the acceptance of funds from Lueders Environmental. They have been extraordinarily consistent in their willingness to provide us with some funds, for which we're very grateful. Do I hear a motion for the consent agenda? Thank you. Ms. Scotto. Do I hear a second? Thank you very much. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Good. Thank you very much. We'll start out then on subcommittee reports with finance. Ms. Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no substantive business to report, as we have not met since our last full school committee meeting, but our next meeting is on January 14th here at Town Hall at 8:30 in the morning.
Great. Thank you so much. Capital improvements, Ms. Chalupsky.
I don't have much to report, except there are two committee of sevens meeting. One tomorrow on the modulars at 2 o'clock, and the other one on give me a sec. It's next week, but Thursday the 10th. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thursday the 10th. I think that's it. What I don't, huh?
Which one is that?
The high school is on Thursday the 10th. And we should have gotten the Pierce School bids, but I don't know if we did or not. Okay. And that's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chalupsky. Let's see, curriculum, Ms. Scotto.
The curriculum report will be equally short. Just a reminder that we will be meeting on January 15th at 1 in the afternoon, and we will be looking at the state initiatives for the ELL program. So we hope many of you will attend.
Great.
The new state initiatives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's February. Thursday's the update on the evaluation pilot and PHS.
That's okay.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. That's February. Yeah, we're meeting on Thursday about the educator evaluation. Yes, indeed. Maybe by Thursday. Tuesday.
Tuesday, the 15th.
Tuesday the 15th.
You got the date right.
Maybe I will be a little more alert by Tuesday the 15th. Thank you.
1 o'clock.
At 1, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Scotto. For government relations, Ms. Stone not being here, I'll just remind everybody that we have the breakfast, legislative breakfast coming up a week from this Friday. Starts at 8:30, and I hope all of you will attend. It's usually lively and informative for both sides. Yes, Ms. Chalupsky.
If I could add one thing to put on your calendar, EDCO policy forum will be on February 1st at 10 a.m. in Weston this year. Yes? And it will be about special education. challenges that all the districts are facing. So it should be an interesting topic. That's really hot off the press. So,
And it would be from 10 a.m. until
usually
roughly?
10 till 12.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a light breakfast there, usually when we get there.
And for my own benefit, is EDCO still in the same location as it was?
No, I said it'll be in Weston Town
Oh,
Hall.
right,
The
okay.
actual EDCO meeting room is not large enough for all the districts, plus the other people who may come together
Okay.
with each district.
Thank you.
You'll be getting information on an email about this, but I just wanted to give you all a heads up.
Negotiations, Dr. Warren?
Negotiations has not met, and
Thank you. Policy review, Ms. Stone is not here. Does anybody? have an opinion?
Just our upcoming meeting, which I believe is a week from Wednesday. is it?
January 16th.
January 16th. Right. Right. January 16th. And I'm sorry, I don't recall which policies we're dealing with. Ms. Coy, do you recall? Yeah, okay. But it'll be part of the agenda that'll go out, I think, next week.
And we know that you have plenty to deal with.
We have a few, yes.
So we're not worried about that.
I wouldn't. No,
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow. So are there any additional liaisons that anyone would like to bring up? I might bring up here the so-called Case for Space Committee. Although I should say at the beginning that that name is subject to change after our committee forms. There have been a few comments about that. But the committee is formed, subject to selectmen approval this coming Tuesday. And I will tell you who the committee people are for your interest in case you want to make any comments. The two selectmen are Ms. DeWitt and Mermel. The two school committee people, as you know, are myself and Ms. Stone. We have two parents. They are Catherine Craven, who was formerly the executive director of the School Building Authority. Amazing. She is very responsive and enthusiastic, and she actually at the first opening ribbon cutting that we had mentioned to me that she would be interested in volunteering for something. I was really impressed. And Philip Kramer. By the way, Catherine Craven is from out Baker Way, and Philip Kramer is a Pierce parent, and has been he's an architect and has been a very constructive person regarding the auditorium activity.
No pun intended.
I'm sorry about that. You're right. It didn't even occur to me. The Building Commission has offered us George Cole. Terrific. He was terrific, I think, at Heath.
Yes.
And he's also been very responsive already. The two community people are Fred Wang, who was formerly a school committee person and is a physician, and a woman by the name of Lisa Crosley, who lives on Clark Road and who is a research scientist at Brigham and Women's. And the two advisory committee people are Neil Wyshynski, who many of us know, who's a great numbers person and a wonderful committee person, and Michael Sandman, who was formerly, I think, very much involved with the transportation. Yeah. And I've known him for some time as well, and he is a consultant and a very astute person, and I think will add a lot to the committee. and our superintendent and also the town administrator will join us on that committee. And I think that's, if anybody can count up, it should have been 13 that I mentioned. Just check to make sure. I'm sorry, the first meeting is scheduled for Monday, the 14th of January. And that will be an introductory meeting, but we'll try there to flesh out when the rest of our meetings are going to be and what our principal objectives are going to be. We'll see what happens. Yes?
I'm wondering what the timeline is for this committee?
My objective is to have this committee complete its activities by the end of June. And they will be both advising us, for example, on the if we decide that we need one, a new school concept, and also advising the Board of Selectmen on what they see as the financial implications of whatever long-term plans there are. I'm glad to take questions. Yes, please.
Just curious, is there a written charge for this?
Yes, I actually,
it to us,
I
yeah.
shared it with you. There may be an adjustment. I understand that one of the selectmen was interested in making a judgment. I think that that person has been discouraged from making the adjustment in the charge, and when the vote comes on Tuesday, is going to ask that certain things be considered. But there, if I understand the certain things that that person wants to be considered, that's no problem whatsoever, because we'll consider any ideas or subjects that come up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to comment, it seems like a very strong committee. I mean, George Cole was involved with the MGT of America study that we did, and so Catherine Craven is fabulous
Right.
person to get on the committee. So
I truly agree with you. I think we're very fortunate. I'd like to take the credit, but I can't. Okay, we're at the point of public comment. Ms. Coyne, is there anyone signed up? Sophia Johansson. Let me just say, Ms. Johansson, that don't be surprised if you don't get any response from the committee. It's a time just to say what you'd like to say, and we hope you'll do it in a reasonably short amount of time, and we will consider very carefully what you say.
Okay, all right. Good evening, Happy New Year. So my name is Sophia Johansson, and I am the parent of a 3-year-old in the Brookline Public School System. My son is currently enrolled in pre-K 5 at the Lynch Center, which is the substantially separate classroom for children with autism spectrum disorders or social and communication disorders. But I actually did not come here to talk about autism or my son. I came to talk about me. I wanted to share just 3 values that came into my life as a result of my education in the Brookline Public Schools. Those 3 things are community, creativity, and resourcefulness. When I think about my time at Lawrence, I think primarily about community. The feeling and culture of my experience there was shaped by close and comfortable relationships with my teachers, peers, and their families. But when I think in particular about my experience at that school, the curriculum that really empowered me was the Understanding Disabilities education that we received in 4th grade. We learned about the various types of disabilities that people can have and how to support people with those kinds of differences. We were taught how to assist a person who's blind by offering our elbow instead of taking theirs. We learned through wheelchair races in the cafeteria how navigating the school would change if we were wheelchair bound. And I also remember actually hearing from a parent who served on the committee with Dr. Warren and Ms. Terlepsky about her own speech impediment and how it was important for us to listen and wait for her as she got through her stutter. So the lessons that I learned in this curriculum have served me repeatedly over the past 20 years. And not only do I understand how to respectfully interact with someone with a disability, but I also know how to embrace people of all sorts of differences and actively live in community with them. This theme of community was carried over at the high school level as part of my experience in SWS. I remember being actively engaged and making decisions with my peers in what we described as a, quote, democratic setting. I'm sure you, yeah. Oh, awesome, excellent. Rich was there when I was there, too. Yeah, excellent. Oh, wow. But I learned how to talk with my peers about issues that affected all of us. And we learned how to work together to make really hard decisions. Looking back, I don't know that the decisions that we made really would make or break our education, but they felt significant at the time, and it was crucial to figure out how to work with a group of maybe 70, more than that, kids. And that skill has served me well long after high school. So in addition to understanding how to build and maintain community relationships, SWS also encouraged me to think resourcefully and creatively about my education itself. Regardless how wonderful the high school was and still is, it just didn't work for me. So instead of staying there and finishing, I lived the democratic model and took control of my education and started college a year early. And I'm proud to say that while I do not hold a high school diploma from Brookline Public High School, that I hold an honorary diploma from SWS, because Brookline Public High School doesn't award honorary diplomas. But in the spirit of SWS, they do. So this ethos of taking control of my situation and creating my own options has definitely served me well since high school, particularly as the parent of a child with special needs. I've had to bring a critical mind to creating and managing his treatment plan and his therapy goals. I've had to learn a lot about childhood development, the IEP process, how to work with different specialists, clinicians, and teachers. It's been an incredible journey, and I feel very confident saying that both Vicki Milstein and Pat Vonnegut's staff have partnered with me in creating a positive educational experience for my son. And for that, I am very grateful. But I'm also grateful for how Vicki has embraced and empowered me as a parent in the school system. I'm currently working on a fundraiser with the co-coordinators of the Parent-Child Home Program, which is the town's early childhood literacy program for income-eligible families. And I sit on Beep Connections as a parent representative with Ms. Terlepsky. When I think about a cost-effective, collaborative effort to improve Brookline's education for at-risk students at the early childhood level, Beep Connections and what Vicki has done is exemplary. She has worked with Debbie Fellman to convene stakeholders from Brookline Recreation to the Housing Authority to music school to BATV to the library, and the list continues. I'm sure that you can really speak to the success of that model and that
So,
team.
Ms. Johansson,
I understand.
you will be soon at 5 minutes, which
Okay.
I hope you will.
So why am I bringing up Beep Connections, right? Okay, I'm getting there. I'm bringing this up because of the budget freeze and the $400,000 deficit. This is the third school committee meeting that I've attended this year, and I recognize that you all have a lot of work to do in the coming months and years as our schools are renovated, our curriculums revised, and our programs re-envisioned. I have nothing but compassion and respect for the significance of the work that lies ahead for this committee. I, too, along with many other parents, share your nervousness When I hear Dr. Lupini talk about a hiring freeze for paraprofessionals in the school system, I think about the aides in my son's classroom. I think about the likelihood of more children coming into that classroom over the upcoming months and the importance of an appropriate staff-to-child ratio. I think about how the extended school year program that will hopefully be offered to my son will look different from what children like him were offered this last summer. I think about how home services for children like my son have changed since last year. And I think about Brookline's reputation as a model school system and about the heartfelt belief that every child in our community deserves equal access and equal opportunity. The truth is that our children will survive no matter what we do.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up now, please.
Okay. I'm concerned about the needs of gifted students, the needs of minority students, the needs of economically disadvantaged students, and particularly students receiving special education and accommodations. With impending budget cuts and other uncertainties that lie ahead, our schools are going to look very different. They're going to change. And it's my belief that if we want to uphold the reputation of our school system and our community, we need to work together. It is my belief that if we want to continue supporting students with special needs, that we will need to be particularly innovative because so many of these effective programs are so expensive. If I may be so bold as to suggest to this committee about how to conduct your work, I would love to see you assemble a group of stakeholders like Vicki has. I would love to see this committee consider forming a focus group to discuss how to continue supporting children receiving special education and accommodations. We are very lucky to have, as Ms. Dickhoff said last meeting, 10 of the world's experts living within our town borders. And I would love to see us utilize these intellectual resources, perhaps including parents and teachers across all age levels, including individuals with town governments, perhaps a representative from the Commission for the Disabled, and stakeholders outside of the school system and town government. I came to you this evening to share and reflect upon the 3 values that I adopted as a result of my education here, which are community, creativity, and resourcefulness. But
So,
I'd
Ms.
like to add a
Johansson,
4th value, and I'm done, which is just innovative collaboration, which is what I've learned as a parent. Thank you.
Okay, if you had more to say and would like to put it in writing and send it to us,
That's it.
that would be just fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Well, Mr. Reed, it seems appropriate for you to come right after that. Thank you.
All right, so the first thing that I have to say is that the revisions to the attendance policy have just been approved by the Administrative Council, and that this policy will be brought to the full faculty vote on January 8th. Second off, some of you may have read something about this in the Sagamore, but a lot of things I've been hearing from students in the past month were some concerns that there might be censorship of the arts at BHS. And this basically stemmed from an incident where there were some cuts to a Shakespeare play that students felt had been prompted by faculty outside of the drama department. And I talked with Ms. Holman about this for a bit, and I don't know all the details of the specific incident, but basically it was that the drama faculty, this did not come from outside the drama department, and they'd agreed to make the cuts themselves. And there is a dialogue going on between faculty and parents at BHS about controversial issues in the arts that students choose to work on. And it's basically just talking about how teachers can guide and talk with students about those issues. And after talking with Ms. Holman, it's clear that there really isn't any censorship of the arts at BHS and that students' work isn't censored. Finally, there is a headmaster student leadership group starting up that Ms. Holman is pretty excited about. And finally, I would like to say that the technology policy is close to a vote, but I also remember saying that exact thing in my last report. And while I'm optimistic that this is the case, I will refrain from making my optimistic comments until the policy actually gets passed. Hopefully in the future, near future. Thank you, that's it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sam, as usual. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms.
Yes,
Chalupsky.
I thought at one time we were receiving the Sagamore online, and I don't remember getting it recently. Maybe I'm,
You were receiving it online? It's actually, they have a website, it's posted on their website.
Right.
Yeah, all the articles are available online.
is there a way of having it?
Give me a ring tomorrow, and my grandson.
Well, maybe,
Did we receive hard copies? Or we did not this time? Okay, we'll,
maybe you can just forward the, whatever.
Right.
So that we can just
The
click
link?
on it. Yes,
Sure,
thank you. That was the
absolutely.
word I was looking for.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions for Mr. Reed? Hearing none, Dr. Lupini.
Thank you. You have a copy of the written report, and I have two items to add to the report. First of all, there's a listing of our students who were recently involved in the Eastern District Music Festival, which took place in November. 34 Brookline High School students auditioned as part of that festival. 20 of them were accepted to the Eastern District Music Festival. And in addition, 9 of the students, and I've provided you with a list of this entire group, but 9 of the students were also accepted as part of the All-State Music Festival. They have a terrific group of teachers, Mike Driscoll, Carolyn Castellano, and Susan Bill, who work with the chorus, the band, and the orchestra. So congratulations to all those students and our 3 terrific teachers. Jacqueline Yu, who is a senior at Brookline High School, recently we received notification that she she had taken the AP Biology exam in May of 12. The College Board characterizes her status as rather select company. So not only did she score a 5 on the test, but she is one of 5 students in the world who earned every point possible on the exam. That means that she got every multiple choice question correct, and she scored a perfect score on each of the essay exam parts of the test. One of 5 in the world. So congratulations to Jacqueline on that accomplishment. Our own Janet McNeil, our pre-K-8 science coordinator, has been selected to serve on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Science and Technology Engineering MCAS Assessment Development Committee. They won't be buying them business cards. For grade 5, congratulations to Janet. I know she's really looking forward to that work, to being part of the group that's going to look at the grade 5, putting the grade 5 assessment together, and they're lucky to have her. We're having on January 22nd, you received a note yesterday, I think, from me, and you'll receive the letter. On January 22nd at 6:30 p.m., Rick Rogers and I are hosting a meeting for the community at Lawrence to discuss the modular classroom proposal. We have a number, we aren't able to identify the people from the building department and others who will join us for that presentation. Certainly, I would it'd be terrific if a number of you could be there, and I know that there may be members of the selectmen there as well. We're going to discuss the need for the enrollment in the district, something we're familiar in presenting, the need for additional space at Lawrence, and possible location and installation plan for these modular classrooms. And I know Mr. Quigley and I know Mr. Bennett, I'm looking at Mr. Rowe, have committed to be there that evening to help us in particular with those aspects. I sent you a copy electronically with the draft of this report, of the EDCO annual report, and I'm told that you're receiving it directly from EDCO as well, as a electronic version. So if you didn't get that for some reason and you want to make sure you get a copy of this report, which they're required to distribute annually by Chapter 43 of the Acts of 2012, the new law on collaboratives, then just let me know. So I can't explain this last item that's in the report. I told Deb Holman and Pete Rittenberg the other day that I might try. I've decided I'm too confused and won't really do so, other than to say that the MIAA has approved a new football playoff system. It was talked about quite extensively in the Boston Globe, and my understanding is that some traditional Thanksgiving opponents could, under this new playoff system, end up playing each other 3 times in a season. Some of those schools who happen to be in the same leagues, in order to get away from that possibility, have requested a reclassification to another division or another region within the state. So Mr. Rittenberg and Ms. Holman have written a letter appealing Brookline's placement. in Division I South for football and requested to be placed instead in Division I North or alternatively Division II South, which would get them away from this possibility of having to play Newton North 3 times in one season. No questions, because I've exhausted more than I now know about this at all.
All I wanted to know is what division we're in now.
We are, under the new classification, we're at,
The old.
we were Division I South, and that's where we've been classified. It's the new playoff system that's caused the problem. There's a system that has you play so many league games, then start the state playoff system, then your Thanksgiving game, and we could end up playing a traditional Thanksgiving rival 3 times. There are a number of schools in the state where this has happened, and so there are some of these appeals going on around this new playoff system. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
I'm good.
And by the way, that appeal is going to be heard sometime in January. At least one other thing. Mr. Rowe and I met with the chief of police on Wednesday, have scheduled a few follow-up meetings. We talked about a number of things around school security that were on their agenda. We talked about a number of things that were on our agenda around school security. We've focused in on a few particular items and are going to continue that conversation with some of our principals, including the headmaster, because one of the issues that's been expressed, I think, the most is around some of the issues around Brookline High School. And so we're going to continue that conversation over the next few weeks. I anticipate that at either our meeting on the 17th, right, today's the 3rd, 17th, or on the 31st, that I'll have some more detail out of those conversations to talk with you about. And we'll do so at that time. But we've just started the conversation with the chief this week. They've been very helpful, as always, in terms of offering some great suggestions for us to work on with them, and we'll continue that conversation, I believe, next week. One other thing on the freeze, only because it was offered as part of the finance report. So by that meeting, you said the 14th? By the 14th, we'll be able to offer details of where we are. I just want to make the comment off of the public comment that was made. We have not said that we are freezing paraprofessional and teaching positions. We didn't say that. Have not said that. What we've said is we're evaluating each position within the system to see whether there is some way to deal with that differently over the next few months for the remainder of this year. There are a number of positions where we found that we can do that. In no case have we said this position remains unfilled, and therefore that function doesn't occur. What we've said is there some way to pick up the difference in some other way? And we've found some very creative ways. Our principals have identified a number of very creative ways to make that work and make it work well for the remainder of the year, or we wouldn't be looking at scaling those positions in some other way. We'll report on details of those conversations on the 14th. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lapini. Are there questions for Dr. Lapini? Yes, Dr. Warren.
Just a brief one. The meeting on the Lawrence School modules, that's going to be at the Lawrence School.
I'm sorry, Lawrence School Auditorium. Thank you.
Other questions? Just to reiterate something that Dr. Lupini said, which is consistently the town services have been incredibly collaborative with us, and the chief of police, I understand, responded instantly in connection with the Newtown tragedy and has continued to be proactive with us, and we just can't thank him and the police department and the town enough.
Also, I should say, and Peter, if you want to chime in here at all, also I should say the building department as well. So long as we're doing that, we had some, we put out something for parents, which I know you all saw, around some measures that we had in place that we feel very good about. Those were not consistent across all buildings because of some challenges in sight and those kinds of things. Pierce being one with two buildings. we had the ability, the reinforced effort from the building department to make sure that we were able to put something in place by the end of that week, to make sure that we were putting in place what we had in place and what we promised throughout the system. We had some areas where some things were not working up to standard, and Charlie had those in place. Charlie Simmons had those in place, again, by the middle of that week. So the building department, again, came through in supporting us in making sure that what we were telling parents we were doing, that we were able to do it.
Great. Any other questions about that? Hearing none, Dr. Lupini, you're on again.
Okay. I told Mr. Rowe today that this is the budget presentation that attempts to tell you lots of things about what we're thinking about without actually indicating any of what we're thinking about. Because to sort of start telegraphing, we have these kinds of issues that you know about and that I'll talk a little bit about here tonight, and go into specifics automatically leads people to believe that those are the areas that you are indicating that you're going to look at for reductions should the need come about to do that. So I'm going to try to talk in some generalities and get a little bit specific on some issues, most of them having to do with the areas that are on the table around program improvements. So if I don't mess this up, there it is. How about that? Okay, so let me just do sort of a brief overview about some of the assumptions that went into the town-school partnership issues that we're dealing with, most of which Peter highlighted for you in much more specific measure the last time we were together. So in terms of state aid, remember that, that we're in year one of a 2-year move to raise the floor on state funding, right? Around Chapter 70 specifically I'm talking about now. That is that over a 2-year period, the goal at the state level was to raise that floor to a certain percentage. It was raised, the majority, more than 50% of that figure in the first year. And if they followed through on the complete second year assumption, then there would be somewhere in the neighborhood, I believe it's of an additional $2 million in Chapter 70. The assumption built into the town-school partnership, I think a more than reasonable assumption is that they will not be able to do that. I think given the recent 9C proposals that we've seen, I think it's more than reasonable to assume that they will not be able to meet that full obligation. And so what's built into the town-school partnership is an assumption that that figure is $1 million instead of the full $2 million. So that's one of the assumptions that drives these areas that we're talking about in terms of town-school partnership. Local revenues are up, but they're not up in any of the specific categories other than the usual suspect, which is the property tax area. That's where we've seen the increase in local revenues, and that's what drives the town's ability to put additional dollars into this formula. Circuit breaker is a little tricky for us right now because the assumption in the town-school partnership was a similar percentage to what we were dealing with when we first ran the town-school partnership numbers. I believe that was close to the 75% figure. Since then, remember that circuit breaker is one of the areas that's been targeted in these 9C reductions. And so there may be an adjustment downward here, depending on what we see happen over the next 6 months. But I think we're more confident now that that number would be closer to 70%. I will say also we've spent a lot of time over the last since the first quarter, taking a look on an every other week basis at out of district placement numbers, at ancillary service numbers,
in an attempt to make sure that that we're able to stay on top of those in reporting second quarter and dealing with what the actual shortfalls might be in those areas in terms of this FY13 budget. And one of the things that we noted today in that work, and I have to say, I just want to make sure I give appropriate credit here. Chris Nunes, who we brought on last year to do this work, has very quickly gotten on top of these efforts and really been able to identify and put together great reports for us that in a few hours in a meeting we're able to really dive very deeply into this information that I can say in the 9 years I've been here we've not been able to do. One of the things that's quite evident from Chris's reports is that in terms of out-of-district placements, we have a number of age outs for next year. You'll hear that over and over from us over the coming weeks as we lead up to the to February 14th and the budget presentation. Remember, however, that the downside of those is a decrease in circuit breaker, because those out-of-district placements, particularly rather costly out-of-district placements, sometimes make up the majority or some very large percentages of your circuit breaker dollars. Now, certainly the circuit breaker dollars never match, what you're expending as a district. Nevertheless, when they go away, you can. So your question might be, and it would be a very legitimate one, 70% of what? And the answer is we don't know right now. We'll spend some time between now and the 14th trying to put a number to that so we have something to put in the budget. But there are some rather expensive age outs. Remember this fourth bullet because it's a very important one, and we need to continue to talk about the great work that the town has done in including an enrollment growth allocation in the town school partnership. This year, I believe $700,000 is that number for FY14. That last year, remember, did not just entail classrooms, elementary classrooms, but also entailed positions like the devotion school assistant principal, other areas where we needed to, and will continue to need to in the FY14 budget, to provide support beyond what's been traditional for us of the classroom and the specialists that go along with supporting that classroom. We are very, and you'll see this in a later slide, we are very much at a point now where every conversation with every principal is also about what about guidance, what about assistant principals, what about those other kinds of support personnel that are necessary to support the now exploding number of classrooms within each of those schools. So this is not just a devotion conversation any longer. It was last year, but it's no longer just devotion. And here's another area where there's an assumption built in. Remember, the health insurance assumption built in for this year that drove the town school partnership is 5%. And that is the number you will deal with on February 14th when I present the budget, and I believe on February 28th when Mr. Rowe gives you the numbers to support the superintendent's message. Right? That's what we'll be dealing with, because the GIC doesn't actually set their rates until early March. So 5% is what we'll be dealing with. Whether it ends up there or not, we won't be able to deal with until we make adjustments to our initial projections come early March. So remember, in sort of the general expense category. So the good news is that in 2 weeks at that meeting of the Finance Committee, I think you're going to hear that we've made great strides in terms of dealing with that first quarter shortfall. It's not been easy. Principals have done great work. Our coordinators have done great work. My staff here have done amazing work in terms of suspending some initiatives, some of which you've heard about, which will be delayed 6 months, a year, in terms of whatever the time period is, in terms of being able to put some rather important initiatives into place. But we believe we've done a good job, at least with what we were dealing with before the 9C cuts came. However, that does not negate the need for us to deal with that shortfall in the FY14 budget. think about it this way. All we've done, which is a major accomplishment, I think, is stem the double whammy of having to deal with both the shortfall and the impact of that shortfall on the FY14 budget. We will deal with the majority, we believe, in the end, if a few things break our way. We will deal with the majority of the shortfall. What we will not deal with is the impact of that shortfall on the FY14 budget. Let me give you an example. We've suspended, and you know this, we've talked about it a number of times, we've suspended our data analyst position. So if we make a decision that that position is not coming back, which is not something I would recommend, then we wouldn't have to deal with the double whammy. But if that position is still part of our assumptions going forward, we have to deal with the fact that we've frozen the position for this year and reinstituted it for next year. So we have the impact of the deficit on FY14 to deal with. Special education's an obvious one under this category, so I'm gonna change the tune slightly tonight and just emphasize a couple of points that we have talked about here. And that we'll talk about in more detail both at finance and I'm sure in other discussions along the way. The fact of the matter is that our percentage of students who hold an IEP is lower today than it was 5 years ago. The percentage of students who require an IEP in this district is lower today than it was 5 years ago. Now, lots of people could say that, and I might be one of the people sitting at a table like this saying, well, wait a minute, does that mean this? Here's what it means. Here's what it means. It means that a number of those students are receiving the services that they need through regular education without an IEP. The legal document is not necessary for them to receive the services that they require. And that's in large part because of the work going on in child study teams, right? And the work going on in regular education classrooms that are being supported by those child study teams and by regular ed interventions like the literacy work that we're doing. That number's been coming down, I mean, not every year, but on a regular fashion now for about 4 or 5 years, that percentage. Here's another one. The percentage of out-of-district placements, while we talk about that number and that cost an awful lot, the percentage of students in out-of-district placements is much lower today than it was 8 years ago. Significantly lower. Now, how do I know that? Because the number of students in out-of-district placements is essentially the same. That doesn't speak to the placements. It doesn't speak to what's happened to the cost of those placements or where they might be, those kinds of issues. But in fact, the interventions in place, both in the building on that continuum of special education services, from the services that occur in the classroom on behalf of students, to the learning centers in those buildings, to the intensive learning centers that we've built in those buildings, and even those district-wide programs are serving students well and preventing many students from needing or parents from believing they need an out-of-district placement. That's a fact. It's shown in the numbers. Okay, steps and lanes. We often show steps and lanes as a net cost. Remember, I'm the one that's starting with this presentation and gets to tell you about the total cost. The total cost of steps and lanes is $1.1 million. $1.1 million. We show it as a net. We show it with a calculation for retirements, which, by the way, Mr. Rowe told you recently is small. We believe will be smaller next year than the smaller number that we saw last year. Right? It's been continuing to drop off slightly now, not in an even pattern, but for 3 or 4 years. We believe it would be exceptionally small next year. But let's call step and lane costs what they are, the total cost of step and lane costs, before we start looking at those costs associated with, or those savings associated with retirements, is $1.1 million. Collective bargaining, remember our collective bargaining agreement for next year is made up of a 2% increase and a new top step. There are other smaller components, but the majority of the dollars included in the collective bargaining agreement that we are dealing with for next year is included in that 2% increase and that new top step. The fact is that separate from step and lane, the increase in the collective bargaining agreement for next year is 3.3%. 3.3%. That's without step and lane. The last area on sort of this general expense issue list is materials and supplies. Now in a minute I'm going to flip this to enrollment increases, and you're going to say, there's materials and supplies again. And that's because both are increasing. The cost of material supplies in and of themselves, in the types of materials that we're dealing with, in the textbooks, et cetera, that we're dealing with are increasing. And yes, we're having to purchase more of them because we have more students in grade levels across the system. So what are some of those enrollment growth increases? Well, remember, we're projecting right now, although we're continuing to push on this and adjust it, and we probably have a slightly different number each day, the assumption in our original budget set of proposals is that we will require 10 additional classroom teachers in the K through 8 for next year. Okay? Now, why am I hedging? Because we're now into the middle grades. We're well into the middle grades, right? And it begins to get very fuzzy. We have one situation that we'll talk with you more about in February where we had a position included in that 10, and yet we believe that the position to be able to address the needs of the students is already included in the 6, 7, 8 configuration, right? So we have, some of it's a little fuzzier. It's not going to be 3, right? It may not be 10, but it's not going to be some number that's going to be substantially smaller than that it's going to relieve us of much of this budget issue that we face for next year. The other thing that we're in the process of doing now, which you know is a very difficult exercise in this system, is trying to project what one class will look like as it moves on to the next grade. I mean, there are some numbers. You just saw the January 1st report. There it is, right there. Thank you. You saw the January 1st report. There are a number on there that, as I began to look at them, that we've marked and said this is a grade level at a particular building to be watched for a potential consolidation. But you know that some of those grade levels at some of those buildings are much more volatile than others. And so to try to make that judgment, right, and to try to predict what numbers come into that particular building, and there are 2 or 3 that come to my mind, I'm sure to yours as well, is very, very difficult because we simply don't know what those patterns look like between June and August. That doesn't mean we're not going to try, and it doesn't mean we do believe that there are some potential consolidations there. There will also be some expansions because, believe it or not, and I know you've seen this time and time again, as large as our kindergarten is, every kindergarten number during the growth cycle has increased to first grade. Every one of them. And we believe this 660 will as well by the time they go to first grade because all the groups that came before have done the same thing. So we still have a 10 in there. Long-winded way of saying. We have some number in there for specialists. We're figuring right now, you know, we used to figure, I think some of you may remember, it was 1.1 to 1.2 for every classroom. Right? It was the classroom and some fraction of a specialist. The fact of the matter is that's gone up because our specialists are maxed. They're maxed out in their time allocations. And so each one of these conversations now that we're having whether it's about art, music, physical education, elementary world language, it's no longer as simple as a .1 or a .2. It's much more about taking a look at the total of what's there and figuring out whether there's any ability to push it any more, and quite frankly, in most cases, there's not. And so I think you're going to see a factor that is going to be greater than a .2 for each classroom position that we end up with next year. In fact, based on the numbers off our conversation with principals, and those numbers came from coordinators, I think it's going to be more like a .3 is going to be the factor for each one of those. I mentioned earlier vice principals. We have had, given the size of our schools, at least 2 other conversations about vice principals. At least 2. Given the number of staff members, given the work in terms of particular of evaluation. But when you start talking about schools that are in that 700 range, certainly Devotion, which was more in the 8 to 850 range, you're starting to talk about maxing out the ability of 2 people to do the work that we're asking them to do. And then related service providers includes everything else. It certainly includes guidance counselors, and that's a conversation I think in those budget conversations, I'm looking at Dr. Allen, just about every building, that is some semblance of a conversation. Doesn't mean it's something we're going to be able to do or something that we absolutely believe we should do at every building, but I can tell you that this year it's been a conversation in almost any one of the K-8 conversations, as has occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech, psychology, the gamut of those services. We're taking a look at what we have in terms of the staffing at each of those buildings and our ability to deliver the service, and finding that in many cases we're right up against the numbers where we can do that work. And then I mentioned materials and supplies. We're having to adjust. We have a factor. Dr. Fisher-Mueller and the coordinators have done exceptional work in terms of creating a factor of what a new classroom costs us. And the fact of the matter is that's increasing. It's increasing because the cost of the materials are increasing, and it's increasing because we have more of these classrooms to outfit. And then the wild card in this, which is of course not in our operating budget, but is in that CIP number that we have, which is space rental. And so any chance we get to put space rental up there to remind you that we are continuing to look to move more and more out of our elementary schools and not into Brookline High School, because remember, Brookline High School will be entering its last year of that static 17 to 1750-ish number, and that will then begin the climb where we'll be figuring out how do we extract adult education, how do we extract early childhood programs, other kinds of programs that will be identified, I think, in this concept study that's coming up, and more importantly, where will we be moving them? So, so the program improvement list is always the longest. I'm not sure what that's about, but we're listing here some areas that are part of our conversations, and there are others. But I just want to give you a sort of a flavor of this. Bless you. Out of school time, remember that we have a program review report, and there were some very specific recommendations both around summer programming and around what we do out of school time, some of which are not budgetary at all. I mean, you may remember one that I think we like the most, which is find some way to get the providers of these programs together in a regular conversation so that they can talk, because they learn amazing things from one another when they actually have a conversation about what is extended day doing versus what is Steps to Success doing versus what is the music school doing, all in those spaces. So some of them are not budgetary at all. Some of them, in terms of better scheduling of the space, right? A more centralized view of the scheduling of the space can require the right kind of computer software, programming, staffing to do well. And our goal is to begin to take on some part of those conversations in this budget year. Special education, I told people that I would highlight the conversation specifically from today. So I spent a great deal of my morning, particularly with people at the high school, but really across the K-8 spectrum, on the conversation of the language-based programming, LLD programming, and what that looks like as a significant number of students move out of our elementary program to Brookline High School. We've had some preliminary plans in place. Now we're finalizing what those specifics may look like in terms of supporting those students at Brookline High School, and as well as supporting a number of families who are in the two main out-of-district sites for that type of programming, that being Carroll and Landmark, who are interested in returning, or who may be interested in returning. Just to give you a number, over the next 2 years in that particular, lack of a better term, category, we have 14 students aging out of 7th and 8th grade. 14 students. So, get the programming right and you can do a lot of good for a lot of kids. Get the programming wrong and you'll be having a lot of conversations with Carroll and Landmark about that programming. So that's just one slice that we spent a good deal of time working on today, and that you will absolutely see included in the February 14th presentation. We've been tinkering now for some time with this idea of that we've just lumped together now, Parent Center, Registrar, and Parent University. Main idea here being some central place for the elementary and high school to register, where people get consistent, high-quality service, because quite frankly, the feedback we get is that the experience is varied. How's that for a word? Is varied right now in terms of that registration process, where they can access ELL services, where they can access ECS services, where they can access information about the school system, supports that might be available to them, community resources that might be available to them. And you heard the students from Steps to Success talk about the last component of this, which we had in our original discussion, but which they've pushed me very hard on, which is around the issue of providing supports coursework for parents out of these types of centers. A number of our MSAN partners do that kind of work. The main model that I think that they spoke with you about was the Chapel Hill model, right? That's the material that they provided me with. I think they mentioned that when they presented to you. In terms of credit and non-credit courses, which in some of these communities, the school system merely acts as the central registrar for, if you will, to provide these courses and to bring in partners to provide that kind of work for students or for parents. So more to come on that. I'm not going to go into a great deal on educator evaluation because goodness knows between educator evaluation and bullying prevention and social emotional learning, you've asked me a number of questions about the cost of these state initiatives, and yes, there are costs. They mainly fall, by the way, a few notches down here in the professional development category. And as we come together in terms of the agreement that we'll form with the BEU over our approach to educator evaluation within the regulations, we'll have to address that training of both our evaluators and in terms of our teachers to implement that system, which we must do next year. We are looking now at the issue of revenue collection. Mr. Morris, I think, is most familiar with this as one conversation that's been going on, I understand, at the audit committee. Mr. Chang's been involved in that conversation as well. But beyond that, we're taking a look at how we go about the number of places that we collect revenue, whether it's for the athletic program, whether it's other types of fees, and whether it's best to have that type of function going on in 3, 4, 5, 10 places, or like some systems have done, to centralize it. That is to bring more control and more consistency to the granting of scholarships in those programs, et cetera. And I do believe you'll see us put forward a recommendation that looks at a different way of addressing that revenue collection, which I think would make the audit committee and the auditors happy as well as a nice byproduct. Literacy, just remember that this is a continuation of our efforts around the benchmark assessment system, around LLI, and around the Literacy Collaborative. This will be our continued move toward additional schools moving into the Literacy Collaborative, and moving on with our end goal of making sure that initiative is in each of our schools. I should, you do know also, I knew I'd remember some of these as I go along. The Landmark partnership is another one that's an ongoing. This year, remember, we're in our third school now at the Baker School, and you will continue to see that as part of our work here. In fact, one thing I didn't mention earlier was around Landmark's willingness and certainly our desire to have them involved in some of the work around our language-based program, that initiative that I spoke about earlier. Professional development I've talked some about, although that does not include the myriad of other district-wide initiatives, whether it's around responsive classroom or the other initiatives that we have in place that we've supported teachers and will continue to support teachers as they implement those system initiatives in classrooms. Curriculum and assessment development, there can mean a number of things here. The main one that I want to target is this issue around the conference forms that I know the curriculum subcommittee has talked about, the standards-based conference forms, and our delay of that project with the budget freeze, and our efforts to try to make sure that we can jumpstart that this summer and continue on so that we implement that initiative in September of 2014. And then the continuation of our work in technology. We continue to talk, Ms. Ditkoff, I know you'll be happy to know about this concept of leapfrogging. Thank you for giving us another term. And what we can do not only to make sure that we've met this goal of making sure that every building has wireless access for students, but what comes next in terms of providing every teacher with the core of what we'd like to support them in doing, providing teachers who are willing to experiment and try new things with what they need to do that, and the accountability to make sure that they share that with colleagues, and the students from our MSAN group would not let me get away without reminding you where we are going and in what time frame we are going there with some sort of one-to-one initiative. Whether that one-to-one initiative is as small as making sure that every student has access, right? Or whether that's a bigger initiative, a Burlington initiative, where every student has an iPad, a Beverly initiative, where every student has a laptop, and that is integrated into their learning in every course. That's the parent speaking from the Beverly initiative, and beyond. So where does that fit into our vision of the next few years? All of these issues we hope to be able to address in what's going to be a very, very difficult year. You don't see a slide, and you won't, of what areas are we looking at for these reductions. And I guess the simple answer for you is anything that doesn't touch the directives, the core of what you provided us with, has to be considered for first. A number of you have dealt with me for enough years that you know, first for modification. I don't like elimination, right? But first for, is there some way to take a look at initiative X, which is in place, which may have to be reduced, and figure out, can it be done in another way at some lesser cost? I'm not going to stand up here and pretend, however, that if we're dealing with the number that we have on the books right now, which is a $2 million shortfall, plus, remember, some accounting for the FY13 deficit. So 2 to 2.5 in that neighborhood, that's going to mean that we're going to be able to continue to do every program as we do now. We will not. There will be program in that particular configuration. There will be, if that's what we're faced with by the 14th, and there is some time to go on that. There is some information that will come before that time. But if that's the scenario that we're looking at, then we are looking at, and you can make the mental list, right? We are looking at every aspect of our program that does not impact, at first at least, class sizes, that does not impact requirements, and trying to figure out if there's some way to do that differently, and if not, if it's something that is of lesser importance than something else. And that's a big number. Just as an example, one of the issues that we've talked about from time to time is a program at the high school which fits that definition. And I'm only offering this as an example. I could offer others. In fact, I should probably. The tutorial program at Brookline High School in total is slightly less than $1 million item. Okay? Is slightly less than $1 million item. Peter, I should have done this before, but just to put you on the spot a little bit, the total cost of math specialists-ish. Yeah, $700,000-800,000. So that's just to give you some idea of the numbers for 2 issues, and I could give you a list of 10 more that would at least fit that basic definition, right, of what we have to look at in considering what we might have to do should this number truly be $2 million. The cost of our coordinator structure, just to offer up one other one to give you some issue, is in the neighborhood of $1 million plus. Just as 3 examples. And so obviously we're going to have to work closely with the finance subcommittee. We're paying attention to any new information we get when the governor releases his budget, what we end up seeing out of the 9C cuts, you know, what will be the impact of the fiscal cliff that didn't really go away in terms of what we see from federal dollars, because the latest issue of Education Week is saying we're still looking at potential cuts in those areas. That I didn't even have up here as a slide. Title I, special education, we're still facing the very real possibility of cuts to those areas. That would add to that deficit. And again, information we won't have by February 14th. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of being able to preview for you where we'll be, what, 5 weeks-ish from tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Lupini. Would you answer questions for us?
Happy to do so.
I'm not surprised. Thank you. Are there questions for Dr. Lupini, please? Ms. Cox.
I'm just looking at the list of program improvements, and I think I already know the answer to this question, but I don't think this is listed in terms of prioritization.
No.
Okay.
No, absolutely not.
Is there a sense of prioritization, or?
Well, the difficulty in that is that would pretend we knew exactly what each of these means and therefore what they cost. I mean, some of the prioritization may be put in place by how simply they can be put in place and at what cost, right? No, I don't. No, because we're not there yet. You know, I'll give you the interesting one in here is one that senior staff can tell you has been sort of the superintendent's pet priority for a number of years now, is the whole idea of the registrar and parent center idea. And yet it's built a fan club, right? It's built a bit of a fan club. We have a number of people, if you think about it, we have a number of people associated with a number of programs throughout the school system, in the elementary schools and the high school, who do something in this area, right? BCASA, as an example, who've latched on to this and said, that's a great idea. we could be this part of that. And so it's built a bit of a it's built a bit of a fan club for what may not be a terribly large cost. We have to sort of figure that out yet. I will tell you that no, because they're very different kinds of initiatives even. So that's the other piece of this. I mean, to compare the issue around revenue collection with literacy, they're not even really on the same list.
Ms. Titkoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly a sobering message, one of in the continuing stream of sobering messages. So this is more of a comment than a question. I think one thing that would be helpful to all of us is if we can, over the course of these conversations, just set out kind of what is the criteria under which we're making these decisions. So, I mean, I'll set out one as an example. I don't want to say this is the only one, but one example in my mind is anything that impacts student achievement or student development is more important than other things, for example. And I think that part of the question is how implementable is it, how expensive is it, how time sensitive is it. I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, I actually loved the conference forums presentation and thought it was fantastic, but I wouldn't be willing to wipe out guidance across the system to prioritize a conference forum. Not that that's a trade-off, they're totally different. But I just feel like sometimes when we look at lists like this, as we get closer to the trade-offs part of this, there's going to be a concept and a dollar amount next to things, and I think it would just be helpful for all of us if we started to have a dialogue about what are the criteria under which we're making some of these trade-offs, not just what the trade-offs are.
We're happy to do that. I will, where some of that gets a little complicated and certainly doesn't change what you've said, is if you take an area like this, like revenue collection, the districts that I'm familiar with that have done that have actually increased their revenues in those areas without doing any harm to their scholarships. So that's a slightly different criteria, but no less helpful.
Right, and I just think that when we talk about program improvements, I would agree, and you've made a compelling case that all of these are interesting, and I'm sure there's a list equally long of things that could be interesting program improvements that we're not considering, and yet when we start looking at cuts, I think it's just going to be a very interesting question of how we decide which things are more important to include and stop, start, and continue, and that prioritization will be helpful for me. One other question, which was, in a previous presentation, there was the 1.2 to 1.3 FTE idea, one classroom teacher plus slices of specialists, but then there were other pieces like guidance, OT, PT, ECS, there's a whole bunch of them. So if you actually add that up, what's that plus, so it's 0.2 for the specialists for every classroom teacher, point what for everybody else that we're actually not adding in that we probably should be adding in?
Great question, and it's not tied in the same way, and that's the difficulty. I mean, we've had conversations, lengthy conversations with each of our principals, and some of those conversations were about 0.5 guidance, and there's a growth of one section in that school, and others are about no increase in guidance, and there's a growth of a section in that school. Here's what I will say that I think will come through as we talk more specifically about these data over the next month. Where we're experiencing, and I think senior staff would agree with this, where we're experiencing more of those other categories are in the larger schools, right? So even though, well, let me say this, two things, are in the larger schools and in the schools that we've traditionally thought of as being very small, which are no longer. But so for example, it's not right to your point, but historically, the Driscoll School has had a math specialist position, or a 1.2, or maybe it's even a 1.0. I was right. 1.9? 0.9. Okay, so I was sort of right the first time. So we're having more of a conversation about a 0.5 or more there than we might in those schools that we've traditionally categorized as the middle size school, because they've been where those positions have not been increased in guidance in math specialists and literacy specialists over some time. In literacy specialists, it really shows, because we quite frankly can't implement the literacy collaborative there with that staffing. Can't do it. It's impossible. Second of all, when you look at, the fact that building Exmoor in the middle has 2 point whatever in math, and this building is still at 1.0, and yet they're there because at one time they were 350 students. And now they're 550 students. It's a big difference. The needs have changed, et cetera. So we're seeing much more of that in those two schools that have traditionally been thought of as the smallest, and those schools like the Devotion and like the Pierce, more even so than Baker, where we're talking more about, and we're not talking about 0.1s and 0.2s in guidance, obviously. We're talking about 0.5s or where people have done great work and probably giving you more than you were necessarily looking for here. But for example, at the in special education, a few of the schools, and more, this is happening now in more, have done a terrific job of blurring the lines between guidance and school psychologists. That is, as we're doing a better job of providing regular education services, supports for kids, and those kids, a number of those kids not needing the testing and the IEPs, psychologists, because we haven't reduced them, and nor should we, have been freed up to do more groups, more those kinds of things, have themselves written into IEPs. It's for support. And so they're taking on functions that if you walked into the building and, I asked you, you might categorize as more guidance function or small group function. And we have a number of our psychologists who've started to do that and are doing excellent work. And so the supports are being picked up in that way. So we actually had 2 meetings with principals, one where people said, I need an increase in this area, and my proposal is to add to the psychologist time, and the next person came in and said, I need more support in this area, and my proposal is to add to the guidance counselor time. And they were both actually saying the same thing. Nobody was looking for more testing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely, and I think what was very compelling about what you said was the idea that there are some places where, again, like if we can't implement the literacy collaborative in a school because of X, or if we can't do some of those core system-wide initiatives that affect every child, that to me, I'll pick that one as an example, is more compelling. Much as I love the idea of parent university, that's much more compelling because it affects a core priority that has to get implemented system-wide that affects all of the children in the district or in a school versus something that affects a select group of kids. So I feel like we have to, and I say this as somebody who, some of my clients do things like parent universities around the country, and I love that model. I think it's critical for a whole lot of reasons. But I just want us to have a conversation about where are we looking at specific programs and where are we looking at some of those core fundamental things that affect everyone. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks.
Ms. Gatto.
This is, I think, mine is more a comment than a question, but a good follow-up to what you were talking about in terms of staffing at the small schools and the large schools. One of the things that worries me when we're in this budget crunch is what I'm going to call creep. It's very easy when you think about trade-offs to say, well, we could take tutorial, but we could do something to tutorial because we have to have this, and it's clear. But I think that the other thing we need to worry about is the fact that there are things like, and of course I'm going to say this, library materials, where there might be less money for them. There are things like, not necessarily this year, but in the upcoming contract discussions, teacher salaries, supplies that are bought where, well, the costs have gone up, there are more kids, well, we might order a little less. And I think that's inevitable. But I think we need to also keep in mind that when that kind of creeping occurs around the edges, that ultimately it makes it more difficult to teach the students in the way that we would like to. Teachers make do. They buy their own books, they bring things in, etc. But I think it just is a concept that we need to be aware of when we're in a tight budget time like this. And I'm not saying we can necessarily do anything about it, but it does impact our education, and I think we need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I agree with that as someone who lives in a household that writes lots of checks for classroom materials. I'm well aware of that, that particular issue. I will say, I think more than most, not certainly on any terrific level, but I think more than most that calculation we've done around what a classroom costs and making sure that funding has been there. I mean, I can only speak to the last 9 years. We've done that to make sure those material budgets are adequate, to make sure there have been some increases in high school budgets around those materials. We've certainly not kept up with all of it. I mean, we've talked often about some personnel items, and we've talked often about libraries and our inability to have kept up with those numbers in the same way as we've done with the specialists and with the classroom materials, those kinds of things. But yes, we need to keep that in mind, and the fact of the matter is some things, by any stretch of any number that we're going to take a look at in this budget, we're going to have to be very open about what those areas are that we're not going to be able to do, because they will exist.
Mr. Chang.
This is more of I need a clarification. In your conversation about health insurance, you have
Yes.
factored about a 5% growth
Yes.
for next year. What is the actual dollar swing per 1 point of movement?
$225,000.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And remember, that's an average. That's an average of all of our plans. Subscribed to by employees within the GIC. I know you know this, but let me get it out there again anyhow. That last year when it was 2%, that does not mean that every plan that every employee subscribed to increased by 2%. In fact, there were plans that decreased in cost last year. I've spoken off. My own personal plan increased by slightly less than 1% last year. So that's the average of the cost within all the plans, adjusted for the percentage of our employees that take each plan.
Other questions? I guess I have one that I'm just always thinking about.
Yes, sir.
Is in classroom, in the classroom supply expenses, to what extent do electronic books or digital books come into play and help at all, or is that not significant and maybe not even applicable K through 8?
So we have
Not the ability to have a reader, to have the tool.
Yeah.
Right. So we have, just to use the mic, we have some areas where they're being piloted. We have some teachers who are utilizing them on some level, and it's one of the issues driving how students will access, whether students have some ability to have a reader to access those in some way. And that, if you recall the accreditation report from the high school and the push that we were getting around accessibility of technology for students and teachers at the high school, that certainly hasn't gone away, and in fact enters into every conversation. Just to relate it back to the conversation I was in this morning around that LLD program, the language-based program, clearly one of the key aspects of any type of language-based program, particularly those programs for students in the middle grades, which, remember, that district-wide program is housed at the Driscoll School, or those students in a high school program, whether they happen to be students who are in co-taught classes with a trained regular education teacher and a special educator or not, is the right kinds of technology for those students to be able to better access the curriculum. And so part of that conversation was around, each of those students having some type of reader as part of their program. Those will be more and more a part of every conversation that we have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it reminds me that to do that, to provide everyone with access, it could be costly in the beginning to provide that access.
Yes. And there are many types of, many levels of that initiative. I mean, and many ways that that's been done. The Beverly program is only one. Certainly the Burlington program was a much different program, much more costly program to the district in terms of putting those iPads in the hands of every high school student, and what we're looking at more closely are some of the programs like Beverly, which made it available to students. They did it all at once, 9 through 12. Our conversations have been around programs like the LLD. Students who do not have the ability to access now, who do not have that kind of technology, providing them with low or no cost access, those kinds of things as a phase-in that can be much less expensive in terms of those initial startups, and which certainly, given what our students have told you now 2 years in a row about the demand of coursework that they're involved in terms of having to turn in papers electronically or whatever they're doing in those courses, where clearly there's more and more integration of the technology into those classrooms. Unless we're going to have, or maybe in addition to whether, Sam, we're going to have an initiative that says there, as the students said last month, that there has to be a technology-free alternative to turning in materials, there certainly has to be the ability for those students to have that same access that their classmates enjoy.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Warren.
I just want to ask, see if my understanding about the circuit breaker is correct. So if there are children reaching age of 22 and aging out of the system, and there's a significant number of them, those funds used to pay for their services this year will be paid for by the district and will be compensated in next year when circuit breaker, if the school's expenditures survive the audit that may or may not come in the summer, and if the students that age out are not replaced by similarly situated students that come in the next year. So it may or may not be an effectively a reserve. It's just a it's a very temporary windfall.
Yeah. So before, Mr. Just remember the term significant with respect to circuit breaker can have at least two meanings, right? One is you said significant number of students, and that is one way. Although remember, a significant number doesn't necessarily relate to circuit breaker, because each of those students has to be above a certain threshold, right? So that's one. The other significant is a individual student with a significant cost. Those students are much more likely, right? A student who's residentially placed, much more likely to impact the circuit breaker over that time, right? Because because there's a larger amount of money from the district being spent on that student. Generally speaking, a more significant number of services, generally speaking, a more significant number of services that qualify under the circuit breaker law.
Correct. I was just going to say, I think the point you were alluding to is the idea that next year's circuit breaker funding is based on this year's spending. Right. So as they're spending, if students age out that are high-cost students, we get reimbursed next year for the high cost of this year. But it means that the following year, since there'd be a reduction in our actual expenditures next year, the cut in the circuit breaker revenue would be in the following year. So we have to understand
It's a very temporary
the change,
thing.
right, and make sure that we
It's a
budget
timing,
for
it's a
it.
timing
It's a
issue.
timing issue.
It's a timing
That's
issue.
right, yeah.
And remember, their services end at age 22. So most of these are not nice, cut-dried, tidy cases of fiscal year ends, students on the books, off the books. Students have birthdays in August and October and January and create these scenarios on the books that lead to very interesting circuit breaker calculations.
Ms. Chalupsky.
And not to belabor this, but there's also the delta that we're paying between 70 and 100%.
Oh, no question about that.
So that would be a savings.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sure. So,
That's a
no
real savings.
question. I mean, I started that piece of the presentation by saying if we have X number of students who are high-cost students who age out next year, there is a terrific savings in terms of the out-of-district placement budget. It's not as much as it appears over time on the books, because there is the loss of that circuit breaker reimbursement, which will never compensate for the cost, at least in part because of that 30% delta that you're talking about, and the transportation and parts of their program that don't qualify for circuit breaker and.
And can I also assume that as the percentage of out-of-district placements shrinks, that the intensity of the placements that we make is greater, and that therefore the average cost is greater?
So here's what you can assume. You can assume that the cost is greater. I'm not sure I'm willing to go with the first part of your statement.
Okay.
Although I think it would be reasonable to assume that given the array of in-district supports that we have, that our out-of-district placements tend to fall into one of at least a couple of categories, okay? One is more intensive kinds of settings. The other is areas, and you know this from our discussion of some of those placement issues, some of the programming areas over time that have not been as strong as they needed to be. And they're real easy to gauge, because over time, if we're able to build better and stronger programming, those numbers change. We had a program that we discussed last year, particularly at the high school level, that we were seeing quite a number of out-of-district placements, included, in fact, quite a number of unilateral out-of-district placements. That's an indicator, right? It's very early. It's only 6 months. We've not seen data that look anything like those data any longer, right? And that was about a 2-year history. So we have a piece of an indicator that program has improved and is doing a better job of serving students, and that the satisfaction level is higher. So they tend to fall into those two broad categories. But yes, I do think overall our people would indicate to you that the types of services going on out of district tend to be more intensive than they would have been prior to some of the in-district types of programming that we have. Yes.
And therefore more expensive?
Well, so I'll say yes, and then add a but. Remember that the programming, I'll get in trouble with my private school friends. So the largest increases in costs in the Commonwealth in education have been seen in this area. Some would say not necessarily related to the intensity of the service. They've seen larger, the fact of the matter is they've seen larger percentages of increases than we see, as an example. And that's largely because of the process by which they can go about seeking those increases. That is, that even though there's a cap, a yearly rate setting, they can apply for restructuring costs, and many do. And while the commissioner has advocated over and over again that he'd like to see superintendents, school committees, others more involved in raising their objection to those increases if they have such objection. The fact is it's a rather difficult process to follow in terms of the notifications that we receive, when we receive them, if we receive them, and it's very difficult to raise any objection that one might have. It almost feels like a process that is meant to avoid our objection.
Okay. Thank you.
Anytime.
Very
Thanks
much. As depressing as it is.
Welcome back.
Is there any new business, first of all, that anyone would like to bring up at this time? Not hearing or seeing any, then I think you all know that we have need of an executive session to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining. Ms. Coyne, would you please poll the committee? Yes. I don't know what would happen if somebody said no. Never thought of that. Okay, then let's proceed promptly, and we will not come back into session. So thank you very much for everyone who attended.